I want everybody to know everything they can about our history. I'm not a believer in cancel culture, the good or the bad. If you don't study the bad, it could happen again. So I do want that subject studied very, very carefully and very accurately. But we grew up with a certain history, and now they're trying to change our history, revisionist history. That's why they want to take down our monuments. That's why they want to take down our statues. I saw something the other day which was absolutely horrendous. Washington Monument, they want to rename it. The D.C. committee, but the D.C. committee is all Democrats. Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson. I mean, we're talking about, this is the big stuff now. This is the big stuff. And they want to rename it. They want to redesignate it. They want to take some down. No, we don't do that. Never going to happen with me, I guarantee you that.
The 1619 Project is an ongoing narrative first published in the New York Times last August, marking the 400th anniversary of the arrival of African slaves to the colony of Virginia. It aims to reframe history by placing the consequences of slavery as the center of America's legacy. As project director Nikole Hannah-Jones put it, the fight here is about who gets to control the national narrative and therefore the nation's shared memory of itself. Jones goes on to say the 1619 Project never pretended to be history, which begs the question as to why it has been packaged as a curriculum for K through 12 students, with many school districts planning to adopt it. Among its claims are the idea that the American Revolution was launched in order to ensure slavery would continue, and that modern American capitalism has its roots in plantation slavery.
Thank you so much, Arthur, for being with us today.
Of course, my pleasure.
Did you read the interviews at the World Socialist? I got to ask, did you read those interviews?
Well, look, I did, and I'm just as surprised as you are. But it is good to know that even among that crowd, there are honest people who,
yes,
kind of care about the facts and are interested in investigating. And they interviewed some of the most prominent historians of the American founding. I mean, Gordon Wood is a household name. And what shocked me about the interviews is not so much that they can falsify the New York Times' narrative. We all kind of already know the arguments about that, but that they weren't even consulted.
Right.
So the most prominent historians in America, and by the way, Gordon Wood is not a notorious conservative. He's, in a sense, a man of the left. He wasn't even consulted. He was surprised by this. And it's an indication to me how the extent to which this is not a very serious project. It's a kind of propaganda campaign to use the pages of the New York Times, its reputation, to impress impressionable minds who will then in turn use the curriculum that's been developed on the basis of that narrative in middle schools and high schools throughout the country.
What really concerns me most about this, there are two things about this. Before we get into what actually went wrong in their analysis. One is that this is sort of a self-serving narrative for the New York Times. It points to a direction there where they're really going to be about demagoguery on race and policy rather than enlightening people. But the more important thing to me is that they're planning on using the 1619 Project to craft school curricula. And I believe, is it the city of Chicago that's already adopted this as its school curricula for history?
That's what I've heard as well. And that's maybe the first one, and there will be more to follow.
Right.
That's the scary thing. Look, I would take a step back and point out this, that the whole point of this project is to say that America is fundamentally racist in its DNA, and that the two main documents on the basis of which America was built, the Declaration and the Constitution, are therefore morally nullified. We cannot be ruled by them. And so here's where that gets us into. It means that we are morally at sea as a nation, especially those that believe in the Declaration and the Constitution as our guiding principle. And if we are morally at sea, we must look for a moral authority who can guide us. And that moral authority is the New York Times. The New York Times wants to get rid of our history so that it can dictate our future. It can tell us what is right and wrong, what is morally evil, what we should liberate ourselves from or rebel against, so that it can guide us as a nation.
So let's start to get to the 1619 Project itself. If people haven't read the Grant Wood, or Gordon Wood, not Grant Wood. Grant Wood was a famous American painter. Gordon Wood interview at the World Socialist website. They haven't read 2 or 3 other interviews that those guys did that were really excellent interviews about the same topic. Where does this project go wrong historically speaking? What are the base assumptions that start them down the primrose path here?
Well, honestly, it's a bit hard to know where to begin because there really is so much wrong there. And I don't speak as, a guy that's bragging about knowing so much. It's that it really gets a lot wrong.
Right.
And it was okay with getting a lot wrong, which is why it didn't consult Gordon Wood. Had Gordon Wood been on that project, half of it would have been axed. So here are some of the main things. Number one, they claim outrageously, without any citations, that the American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery.
Right.
There is not a single source. If you look at the founding documents, the writings of the main founders, there is not a single source which would indicate the truth of that or even support it. So that's one absolutely outrageous claim. Another is the implication that all of our founders basically were white nationalists who wanted to preserve slavery. When you look at the writings of every single major founders, every single one, none of them support slavery, and in fact, all of them condemn it as evil. Not a single one says that this is a good thing. And you can build on that very easily by seeing that when they say all men are created equally, they mean all human beings. If they were white supremacists, why did they have 0 arguments in any of their writings that say, well, natural rights are only for white people? They do the opposite. Madison says very carefully that he avoided using the word slave in the Constitution so as to underline the humanity of slave. The Constitution calls slaves persons. They are always persons because it's very clear that they also possess natural rights and at some point will be liberated from their bondage.
Right. But it's important to remember that in 1619 and in 1776 as well, is that slavery was a global phenomenon. It was not peculiar to the West. It was not peculiar to the colonies, certainly. And the British government was still, by the way, engaging in slave trade. They would dump it before we did, but they were still engaging in slave trade at that particular point in time. So if the American Revolution was a way to preserve slavery, it seems a very strange thing to do to separate from the British Empire, which would arguably have at least protected those interests, especially in the South, right? If that was the motivation, was the South would have stuck with the British in those circumstances. But this is a global phenomenon in 1619 and in 1776, and really the only voices for abolition are coming out of England and the colonies.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I don't even want to indulge in the argument that the revolution was fought in order to preserve slavery. This is just an outright falsehood. And you see, by the way, what it means in this example of what an unchecked press looks like. It is free to make all sorts of inventions like this, to indict an entire nation. And nobody there even thought, well, maybe we shouldn't say this because other people will think that we are ridiculous. On the other question of slavery as a historical phenomenon, look, all of the founders, none of them wanted slavery in America. Not a single one says it. And they all viewed it as a pre-revolutionary inheritance. They inherited this. The British brought it to them. And now they're, in a way, stuck with this terrible institution. And so at the time, slavery existed in many, many places throughout the world. In fact, as you know, slavery still exists in certain places of the world, which the New York Times is obviously not interested in investigating or condemning. The idea was that the American Revolution would be the first time in human history where the principles of political liberty and equality would create a government. There was no such regime before America, and it would be on the basis of those principles that we would eventually get rid of slavery. And that's what happened. That's how Martin Luther King understood his enterprise, through the principles of the founding, that there would be equal rights. That's how Frederick Douglass understood the founding documents, and that's how the founders understood them.
But tell me this. I mean, what are your takeaways from the American Revolution? I mean, you know, its principles, its flaws, and its transcendent values. You got 3 minutes to unload all that.
Easy task. Books have been written about this, but just give me 3 minutes and I'll get it to you. Look, it was, as I said, the first time in human history where rational principles, intelligible to all, would be the basis of a new form of government that had never existed before. Slavery was understood to be the normal occurrence of politics and human life. When you look at the ancient texts, Aristotle, Plato, you see that there's slavery there. When you look at the Romans, when you look at medieval Europe, there is slavery always. This is the first regime whose principles were against that, and whose principles, as I said, were used in order to eradicate slavery. And many Americans felt the truth of these principles and wanted to abolish slavery. There were huge abolition movements, as you mentioned, mainly Christians, who thought that this was in conflict with the nature of human equality. These people took immense risks to themselves, spent much time in arguing against the institution of slavery, knew that it was a moral wrong. These, by the way, the New York Times' goal is to indict not just the founding, but all of the people on the ground in the founding, to say that not only is the nation white supremacist, but the people supporting the founding are themselves white supremacists. There were so many people arguing against slavery, struggling against it for many years. It's the only nation that has abolished slavery on the basis of its own principles. I would urge the New York Times to find another example comparable to that. If you want to see a genuinely pro-slavery document, you should see the Constitution of the Confederate States. It unambiguously states that no law will prohibit the ownership of black slaves as property. It says it outright. The fact that that we are in such a debate today, in my opinion, shows how far away we've gone from being a coherent, stable nation that understands its origins. The fact that such propaganda can be published and adopted by schools so easily shows the extent to which the left thinks of itself, at least, as being on the cusp of a massive victory.
I think that's a great place to leave it, Arthur. Arthur Milikh from the Heritage Foundation. Thanks for spending some time with us. We're gonna get you back on to talk more about this, because we should do a deeper dive on this at some point. But thanks so much for distilling that down in 3 minutes. I gave you an impossible task, and you just spiked the football in the end zone there. So thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks a lot. Pleasure being with you.